Good afternoon and welcome to our plenary session on the impact of COVID-19 on marginalized communities. Let me introduce myself. I am Enrico Del Castello, Director of Knowledge Mobilization and Partnership for Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship Canada, and I will be your moderator this afternoon. First, a word of thanks to Professor Victoria Esses and the committee for having me on this plenary, for organizing an important and very successful conference such as this, in these especially challenging times. It is both an honor and a pleasure to moderate this plenary. Le sujet que nous allons aborder est très actuel. Des recherches récentes ont montré que les communautés d'immigrants ont été particulièrement touchées par la pandémie COVID-19, plus que tout autre groupe. Les immigrants ont été largement touchés par les restrictions de voyage imposées par les pays en mars dernier en réponse de la pandémie. Les immigrants sont aussi plus susceptibles de travailler dans le secteur de la santé et dans des emplois moins bien rémunérés, comme par exemple les commis de vente au détail, les livreurs et les employés des épiceries. Ils sont plus exposés au virus que les travailleurs qui ont la possibilité de travailler à domicile. Recent research has shown that COVID-19 infections have taken a disproportionate toll on racialized communities, immigrants, and low-income population in many countries, including Canada. This past September, the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Services released a report focusing on patterns of COVID-19 testing and test results among immigrants and refugees in Ontario between January and June 2020. It documented disproportionately higher rates of infection among immigrants who landed in Ontario as caregivers, refugees, those with lower levels of education and language fluency, and those who live in lower income neighborhoods with crowded housing. In addition, during the lockdown of economic activities in March and April 2020, the Canadian labor market lost millions of jobs. Findings, a collaborative study from Statistics Canada and IRCC, showed that the immigrant and Canadian-born workers fared differently during this period. Recent immigrants were more likely than Canadian-born workers to lose their employment during the period because their overrepresentation in lower wage jobs. So today, we will be looking at the impact and the potential consequences of the pandemic on immigrant communities. These consequences include discrimination, exclusion, trauma, compromised health, gender-based violence, and disrupted settlement and integration, and really get a sense of how the pandemic affected marginalized communities, and specifically immigrant communities who have been particularly at risk during the pandemic. We will also discuss the remarkable resilience that has been shown by immigrant communities during the pandemic. I am very pleased to be joined today by Nina Kondo, Executive Director of Elmwood Community Resource Center, Don Boddy, Regional Coordinator for MANSO, the Manitoba Association of Newcomers Serving Agencies, Cherylin Jordan, Associate Professor in Counseling Psychology and Equity Studies at Simon Fraser University, and Paul Muamba, Project Manager at Réseau de Développement Économique et d'Employabilité. We will start a presentation from Nina Kondo, Executive Director of the Elmwood Community Resource Center. It is a community-based organization offering services to families in Elmwood. Nina has been involved in community development for the last 15 years. Her presentation is entitled From Discourse to Action. Will highlight the impact of the pandemic on vulnerable and marginalized groups, the service provided in response by the Elmwood Community Resource Center, and options in terms of policy and funding to address the situation. Nina, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Enrico, for the presentation. It is my honor and delighted to be part of this committee and panel plenary. I thank the organizer for putting this event together. Like Enrico highlighted, the pandemic has pernicious impact on society, underserved, underserved, and undervalued population in disturbing ways. Further to the pandemic, it has undermined the historical value, commitment to social justice and human rights while overturning our insistence on the importance of human relation. The disruption of provision of services, especially social services, during COVID, put a spotlight on existing inequality and inadequacy of existing structures. Entrenched social inequalities and economic marginalization have resulted in large proportion of the world population, but also our local community being deprived of the most basic human needs, let alone capacity to be physically distant, while at the same time socially connected and adequately support to meet their living needs. The COVID-19 response has been largely premised on physical distancing, though this has unfortunately been discursively referred to informal and informal discourse as social distancing. There's a big difference between the two concepts, with physical distancing and not necessarily precluding social connectedness, whereas social distancing unavoidably presumes disconnectedness. Physically distancing also produces social distancing and interpersonal disconnectedness, yet certain societal conditions need to be met and made available indiscriminately. Access to basic infrastructure, such as shelters, internet, and basic needs, everyday needs are societal conditions that need to be available to all individuals. Access to basic infrastructure, access to internet is also much needed, especially in the population that we served. Racialized and indigenous community have been disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 disruption. This community already had a deficit in having access to basic communication technology pre-COVID. Now, during the height of the pandemic, they have been further isolated from social network. And as the pandemic accelerated, we can expect the gap to extend or expand. School moved to distance learning. The digital divide between the haves and have-not was laid to bear for all of us to see. The children with access to computer and high-speed internet smoothly transitioned to a new form of learning, while the less fortunate families struggle with substandard devices or older mode of computer or phones, using slow and sporadic internet access. The negative impact of COVID on the economic deprived household in our community is not limited to access to technology. Precarious and lower paying jobs with fewer benefit have also contributed to expanding social inequality. These jobs really doesn't really offer enough paid sick days for one to rest and recover, access to appropriate medical needs, but also access to social services that they need. Furthermore, when there was a contraction between business activity, people working in lower paying position were the first to be let go and suffer the impact of shortage of hours with no guarantee of ever being called back. Many people have been put in a position where they have to choose between their health and the need to meet their basic needs for their families. Times of crisis often reinforce and exacerbate disparity because resources are limited and people are fearful. This pattern is occurring with COVID, which has triggered increasing unemployment, major economic losses. Societal change that are currently occurring during COVID may differentially affect racialized workers, individuals from low-income background, and women living in multifaceted customs. Conflict between multiple life roles such as work and family is relevant concept as it relates to differential impact of COVID-19 pandemic. For individuals who have historically been marginalized within the labor force, it has increased during the pandemic. As school and daycare closed due to social distancing, dual earner parents of children were asked to leave their employment to care for their children and educate. Women are shouldering higher amount of this burden. Women, especially racialized women, are also employed in service sectors that are being hit hard by current societal change in social distancing. According to the statistic, the highest unemployment rate in July 2020 are seen among South Asian with 18.8%, and Arab 17.3%, Black 16.8% compared to their non-Aboriginal or visible minority. Okay, I'm on the stats. Not surprisingly, the financial uncertainty creates tensions, exacerbate existing mental health trauma, and it's conducive to substance misuse or substance abuse. According to Canadian Mental Health Association recent policy paper, show that 1 in 10 Canadian reported that their mental health had worsened a lot as a result of COVID. Similar results were found in a survey of Canadian workers, where 81% reported that the pandemic is negatively impacting their mental health, indicating a significant drop in overall worker mental health since the beginning of COVID-19. COVID-19 pandemic has elicited a perfect intersectional storm in regards to gender-based violence by provoking some of the most high-risk factors that is associated with social isolation, heightened stress and anxiety, economic insecurity, jobless, lack of resources, increase in substance use, increase in mental illness, increase in physical health concerns. Stress begets alcohol use and jobless. As much as job loss begets alcohol abuse and stress, a recent Statistics Canada reported that 1 in 10 Canadian women were concerned about violence occurring in their home during this pandemic. Moreover, those with limited access to resources, such as those living in rural, remote areas, indigenous people, migrant workers, people with disability, racialized, gender non-conforming, trans people, and migrant are experiencing the highest rate of violence during these lockdowns. These negative consequences first multiply the impact of gender-based violence incidents, thus leaving the breaking of family unit. The intersectional impact of the two pandemic, the gender-based violence and the COVID-19, with other forms of oppression, inequity, exclusion, as well as homelessness, poverty, anti-Black racism, disability, homophobia, transphobia have been exposed to all. The pandemic has indeed adversely affected vulnerable marginalized groups in communities as follows. We have a disproportionate representation of workers from low income and racial ethnic minority background in sectors most affected by COVID-19. Lack of decent work for low income workers, increased discrimination over racism acts, role conflict and heightened stress for women when daycares, schools, and external resources are unavailable despite still needing to engage in paid work. Mental health concerns, trauma, gender-based violence, homelessness, all of this has compounded the impact marginalized populations are experiencing with COVID. Here at the Elmwood Community Resource Center, we've responded with the following addition to our services. We partner with various private sectors and nonprofit sector and funders, donors to support us in providing technology equipment. So when the COVID heightened started, we provided over 700 computers to families that were accessing our services. That enables family to access school, their children to access school, to access programming that they were before in person, now virtual. We were able to provide wellness checks, mental health checks, as well as basic needs hamper packages. We increased or we added additional crisis lines where family can access to speak to individual or workers who can support them. We added a basic needs warm line. We also added a warm homework line for children to access teachers for support. We transitioned all our program online, as well as partnering with various organizations to provide virtual programming and services. We partner with local shelters and local community agencies to deliver public education on protection of COVID, to also reduce the stigma and the negative messages that some families were receiving in regards to COVID. We also provided educational material to those families as we were doing wellness checks and delivering hampers. Now, what we can do in terms of responding to these changes or the pandemic impact on the population by engaging into social policy practice, and ensuring social protection for society underserved population can make a significant contribution to cushioning the fall out of the global pandemic. Returning to social protection, social services, private sector, funders, policymakers should advocate for policy that respond and long-term funding options, but not limited to the following: implementing services and intervention that are culturally safe, but also linguistically accessible. What we hear often from families that these virtual programming are giving services that are higher level English that they may not understand what exactly they're delivering. Developing reform policy for criminal justice system, school system, and any structure we have in place that's the minority unfairly targeted or discriminated against. Coordinating effort and collaboration between all levels of government with community-based organization, the private sector for transformational multi-pronged policy and intervention. 4, implementing a national gender-based violence response for both sectors, the anti-violence sectors and the settlement sectors, as well as coordinating response between all sectors. And lastly, collect timely, accurate, aggregated data for underserved population. We need to act swiftly in order to respond and tactfully to define our potential response to this pandemic. We need also to evaluate our response in a holistic manner with long-term sustainability for societies, especially for our underserved population. We need to draw more assertion and information around hope, resiliency, and the resolve of human spirit to surmount any impediment. The tenacity, I'll leave you with this quote: the tenacity of human spirit in our collective resolve for solidarity and survival has and will always overcome and outlast any pandemic, including COVID-19. So for that, let's keep hope. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Nina, for that presentation. You've given us a lot of food for thought. And indeed, as the title of your presentation said, from discourse to action, I think your words spoke plenty of action. Is there anyone from the audience now that would like to get a chance to ask a question about what was just presented by Nina? Okay, here we are. This is a question, I will read it to you. Many of the discrepancies are grounded in economic inequality. How can we, as a sector, advocate for concrete resources to address these inequalities? Nina.
Thank you. I believe by collectively working together from a policy, from community agencies and private sectors in developing responses that are meaningful to families. So creating jobs that can be accessible and easy for newcomer and settlement sector to access easily. We know that employment network is not as much available to the settlement sector. So by developing and creating or amplifying those networks for the families, that would be first thing we can do.
Thank you. Any other questions for Nina? There we are, another, that's good. So I will read it. Oh, that's all so far. Okay, so you will get a chance to move ahead in the final session if we have time. But let me introduce our next presenter. Next is a presentation by Don Boddy. Don is the regional coordinator for Manso. He has worked for nonprofit for the majority of his career and has spent the past 7 years working in the settlement sector in rural Manitoba. His presentation is entitled Centering Stories. It speaks about the reality of COVID in Manitoba and about the impacts of marginalization and about newcomers who have experienced the impact of COVID. I will thank you, Don, and I will leave you to your presentation. And I understand that if technology helps us, we'll even have a video. So the floor is yours, Don.
Thank you, Enrico. Thank you, other panelists. It's really good to be part of this with you. I'm honored to be asked. I also want to say that I'm coming from Treaty 1 territory, and I'm understanding more and more every day what that means and what it means to live in reconciliation. There are going to be 2 quotes that drive this presentation. I love a good quote, and as we go along, I'm not going to be reading stuff, but these quotes sum up what I want to talk about. Is that the truth about stories is that's all we are. And some of us are really good at telling our stories, and some of us are really good at sharing our stories. And Sane Doob has a powerful quote about the impacts of COVID-19 and how part of this and the impacts on marginalized people is not a new story. It's an old story of power, of belonging, of not belonging, of keeping people out. And so hopefully we can begin to retell that story in a new way and help to give marginalized people a voice and hear those voices. I want to tell you the story of COVID in Manitoba, and it's been the pandemic story of my life so far. Manitoba, the lockdown first started on March, I think it was March 20th, it is March 20th. And at first, the implications for the most of Manitoba was that around the lockdown and loss of employment. There were lots of other difficult decisions every day. Schools were shut down, and every day we were learning about code green and code yellow and code red. And in the middle of the early part of the summer, numbers were very, very low in Manitoba. And then as we got to fall, it began to steadily rise. And stories of illness and stories of death and stories of recovery were part of every news broadcast. And then on November 12th, the entire province entered code red, to the point where now we are not supposed to have any visitors in our house at all, which has huge implications for many of us. including me in my personal life, has huge implications, as I have a sick dad in the hospital and a granddaughter that was just born yesterday, and we can't go visit those people now, but we need to stay safe and we need to get the numbers down. And I cannot imagine those impacts on marginalized people that are probably greater. Who are the marginalized? Generally, the groups of people and communities that because of unequal power and people who, for whatever reason, often just that they're different, is they become marginalized. The people with the power get to decide who's marginalized, and then we have to recognize what's going on and what the power structures and the power difference is. There are many groups of marginalized people. I'm going to be talking about immigrants, refugees, and migrants, or newcomers, and those who don't reside in the right location. And in Manitoba, that's a huge issue, because 60% of our population lives in one city and the rest of us live in rural Manitoba, and our voice is often not treated the same. So I'm just going to whine a little bit about that. In the light area of this slide is privilege and power and those who feel centered. The dark area is the marginalization areas. Hardly anyone ever feels they're completely in the center. But all around it, we have power, we're connected, we're feeling like it's, we have a voice, where those on the margins might not think those things. In this slide presentation, notice that the marginalized folks are different. They're not worse, they're just different. And for some reason, they're on the margins, and those of us on the inside sometimes don't always understand that. Here comes me. And I'm green because my mom thinks I'm cool. I don't think I'm right in the center, but I definitely have some privilege. I have some power. I kind of have a sense of where I belong. I've been in Canada all my life. I'm male. It is very important that as we start talking that, or I want to say marginalization and bringing people to the center is not that simple, but it really is. And sometimes it's just talking and listening. Sometimes it's just connecting with folks. It changed my life when I started working in the settlement sector and I heard people's stories. That really impacts me. So as we hear people's stories, and then we can even start to invite them and change the margins. I want to talk about centering stories. If you got 15 minutes in your day, please watch The Danger of a Single Story by Chimamanda Adichie. It's a TED Talk. It is life-changing. My daughter put me onto it. Stories matter. There are stories that can do damage, but stories that can also repair dignity. And the other important thing about stories that's so important is we have to hear more than one. Just don't hear one story and think you understand. Keep listening. Now I want to share with you 3 stories, and they're called centering stories because they're people who could be seen as marginalized and sometimes feel marginalized. These stories are only these people's stories, but they're representative of stories that go on all over Manitoba, Canada, and the world. All 3 of them, 2 of them are here from Portage Prairie, my community, but all 3 of them are friends. They're telling a powerful story, and so now I ask that you have ears that hear and a heart that's open and just really see the stories. Thank you, and if we could play the video now, that'd be helpful. Okay. I could play the video here, it won't affect anything, eh?
We're just getting organized with the video, so we ask you for your patience. On attend les vidéos, donc on vous demande votre patience. nos techniciens, ils travaillent très fort là-dessus. Our technicians are working very hard at getting the video up and running. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sylvia Cibrian Medina. I'm from El Salvador, and I'm gonna talking about my COVID experience. I got COVID-19 from my husband. We both got sick almost at the same time. We got all the symptoms, fever, sore throat, a lot of pain, headache, nausea, we lost our smell and taste, headache. It was so horrible, feel those things, and we felt very worried about how this will affect our health and if we will affect other people because we were in contact with other people and we will worry about them. So we felt a lot of uncertainty. We felt the fear to die, and we prayed a lot. We felt a lot of sad about it, and so it was a very bad time for us. But we got a very good health system. They were so great on us. We didn't feel any discrimination feeling. They were calling us every day to check in on us and how we were feeling, if we were getting better. And that was great, and we felt so helpful and appreciate that. We got a lot of helping of our community. Our friends were there to helping us with groceries and everything we need. That was really good. We also got government economic support during this time, and even though it was a very hard time on us, we learned a lot of stuff. Like, we learned to be thankful for everything we have, to be grateful for our friends, because we feel that support, that love on us when we passing through this. And we believe in God, and we know that whatever is happening to you will happen for a reason, and He will holding you to keep going, to be better for you and better for other people. And I wanna talk each other that we need to be respectful. Please follow the rules, the social distancing, and try to be safe on one another, because that's the best way we can do to stop the spread. Thank you.
Migrant workers have always had a challenging landscape to navigate when it comes to asserting their rights and protecting themselves from exploitative recruiters and employers. Migrant workers in the temporary foreign worker and agricultural worker streams have also had to navigate the complex systems that brought them here, while dealing with work permit renewals, health card applications, and in some cases permanent resident applications as well. In general, these systems have been slow to respond to the needs of workers, and have sometimes been a roadblock to workers asserting their rights. For instance, in some jurisdictions in Canada, migrant agricultural workers are not allowed to join a union, a right that Canadians and permanent residents take for granted. Many others have been systemically barred from receiving employment insurance benefits as well, even though they pay into these systems every paycheck. Since the pandemic has hit the world, long-standing issues affecting migrant workers have come to the forefront and exposed the inadequate working and living conditions of these workers. Cramped bunkhouses in the farms that have been housing many workers all in one room with little ventilation have proven to be deadly for workers because of the increased risk of COVID-19 transmission. We've seen pictures on social media and on TV of workers trying to set up cardboard barriers to give themselves some protection. In our country's large corporate-run slaughterhouses, we've seen the deadliest outbreaks in all of North America take place. Working and standing shoulder to shoulder with one another has always been dangerous on the meat production lines. Workers have often reported being stabbed by one another accidentally because of the close proximity and sharp knives they use. During the pandemic, the shoulder-to-shoulder working conditions have brought misery and death to these workers because of the increased COVID-19 transmission. Luckily, during the pandemic, many organizations have stepped up to give direct support and also advocate for the rights of migrant workers. My name is Diwa Marcelino, and I'm proud to be an organizer with Migrant Manitoba, a chapter of Migrant Canada, which works to protect the rights and welfare of migrant workers across the country. We also conduct education, research, lobbying, and campaigns, and are part of larger alliances of migrant-serving organizations like the Migrant Rights Network. We work to build solidarity with migrant organizations and peoples who are against the plunder of economies, the destruction of the environment, and wars of aggression that have caused widespread poverty and injustice, which in turn causes forced migration. We dream of a society where families are not broken up by urgent need for survival. We dream and actively work for a homeland where there's opportunity for everyone to live a decent and humane life.
Okay, thank you, Don, for this presentation. It was good. I'm glad that the video worked. So what you told us that there are two realities about marginalized people. One, whenever anything happens in the world, bad happens in the world, it seems to have great impact on marginalized people. Also, marginalized people have a difficult time having their voice heard. Why is it important to hear marginalized people, and how do we create places where their voices can be heard?
Often when we hear from people that are not like us, we learn and we get a different perspective, and life is not the same for all of us. And so that gives us a broader vision of what it means to be human, of what it means to live in our community, and of community gaps and of community strengths. And so just, it's not always that simple, but sometimes it is. Just talking and listening and hearing and providing places for people to share their stories is a great first step.
Thank you for that. We will allow, as I say, for other questions during at the end of the plenary, but I just want to move on with the next speaker, Cherylin Jordan. She's the Associate Professor at Simon Fraser University. She conducts community-engaged research and knowledge mobilization on the implication of homophobic and transphobic persecution for refugee protection, settlement, and mental health. The pandemic has highlighted and amplified pre-existing problems for LGBTQ1 newcomers, creating distinct risks to safety, health, livelihood, housing, and social connections. Cherylin will address this topic in her presentation entitled Addressing the Amplified Risk of Pandemic Times for LGBTQ Refugees, Learning Now and for Renewal. Cherylin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you to my fellow panelists. I'm looking forward to a conversation that highlights marginalizations across differences. I'm here on the unceded Coast Salish territory and want to pay my respect to the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations, and also acknowledge the tension that my work occurs in. On the one hand, colonization is a source of many, if not most, of the hate, persecution, and marginalizations against diversity of sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. And so this work can be profoundly decolonizing, and at the same time sort of the grand narrative of Canada as a unique place of acceptance for LGBTQI has been used in ways that are profoundly colonial. And so this is the tension that I walk and work in. People on the move from persecution of their sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression have lived in defiance of social erasure, stigma, hate, threatened, and actual violence. Their surveillance and threat frequently starts in their own families and permeates every aspect of their lives. If they are able to escape, they must navigate restrictive borders and a refugee regime that was not designed with LGBTQI people in mind. The geopolitics of rising nationalisms, ongoing neocolonialism, and highly skewed global capitalism makes seeking asylum and resettlement difficult and increasingly dangerous for all, and LGBTQI refugees face distinct risks. And this was before the pandemic. The pandemic has both highlighted and amplified these social cleavages. It's made already precarious livelihoods disappear, intensified risks to safety and health, while hampering the work of civil society organizations that form an essential safety and support network. The pandemic has revealed where we as societies are most fragile, and our collective response of collaboration, collective action, and solidarity to this pandemic have demonstrated our amazing strengths and anti-fragility. What I'll be sharing with you today are lessons learned from the pandemic and that I hope lean us in towards renewal that I've learned while working with, as co-chair of an emerging network, the Rainbow Coalition for Refuge. I hope you'll think of this as learnings. This is not yet sort of what I'd call analyzed research, more like field notes from my community engagement with LGBTQI refugee-focused organizations across Canada who are joining forces to create this coalition. Our goal is to engage people with lived expertise in knowledge generation, in intervention design, and knowledge mobilization and advocacy. A note on language before I go too much further. Humans around the world and across time have lived and understood their sexualities and genders in myriad diverse ways, and trying to language this is virtually impossible. The language is evolving. Today, I will be using SOGIESque, sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, and sex characteristics. You may also hear me use sort of the community vernacular that I'm comfortable with, queer and trans, or the acronym LGBTQI. We've been asked by Two-Spirit organizations not to use Two-Spirit in our acronym when we refer to refugees and newcomers, and to reserve this specifically for Indigenous people of Turtle Island. Before focusing on the pandemic impacts, I want to give you a sense of the pre-COVID international context. It's important to understand that what people have lived through, because it impacts how they can navigate through every aspect of the migration journey. And for those of you who are working with LGBTQI newcomers, you may find this journey map that the coalition created with IRCC helpful, and it's available on their website. And it traces the impacts and the intersectional impacts from country of origin through to arrival and settlement. My work is predominantly with people who have arrived as refugees, but queer and trans newcomers arriving through all migration pathways may have lived through similar conditions. This is because the landscape for human rights for LGBTQI is very uneven, and still, even the right to have rights is still contested. More than half of the countries of the world do not recognize sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression as grounds for human rights protection. Less than a fifth protect against hate crimes or incitement of hate. At least 68 maintain explicit criminalization of same-sex relationships Again, the vast majority of those laws are the legacy of colonization. And 57 at least maintain some kind of criminalization of gender diversity. And so what we have seen is that people who are arriving in Canada have lived through quite often overlapping experiences of discrimination at jobs, workplaces, schools, threat of surveillance from state and non-state actors. And importantly, from their sort of subjective experience, this often happens in family. So experiences of isolation and stigma start early and impact people's ability to seek help, form trust relationships, and sort of confidently navigate the system. I've used the word intersectionality, and others on the panel have as well. And so I'll just highlight ways that intersectionality draws our attention to the overlapping or compounding impacts of multiple marginalizations in ways that amplify risk and vulnerability and also create distinct or unique risks. And I think it's important for us to remember that marginalization is not a trait of a person, nor is vulnerability. It's something that's socially created through processes like economic inequality, like systemic racism and white supremacy. What I'll be focusing on today are impacts of the pandemic, specifically for LGBTQI, and I'll start with international and then bring us into Canada. So internationally, over and above the conditions of hate and lack of protection that I highlighted, we've seen stigma, surveillance, and a backlash really against LGBTQI occurring in many countries. Uganda used COVID restrictions to arrest. In Panama, binary gender is used to dictate when people can go out on which days. And so you can see how for transgender or gender diverse people, this would be incredibly dangerous. We've also seen countries like Poland create new LGBTQI free zones. And so the rising tide of nationalism combined with pandemic restrictions has increased risk. We've also seen that, particularly for those still in their countries of origin, being confined due to physical isolation rules with family exponentially increases risk of family violence. Because people have been kind of pushed to the margins economically in terms of job prospects and work, LGBTQI folks are often working in the informal sector. If they are asylum seekers, it's often as day laborers, sometimes sex work. These livelihoods leave them with no savings and have completely disappeared during the pandemic. Disruptions in migration and resettlement have also combined with restricted access to healthcare. So where people may have needed to travel to sort of the one urban center, you know, Ankara in Turkey or Istanbul in Turkey, to see the one doctor that is friendly and supportive for trans and gender diverse folks, that has become impossible. And access to things like HIV medication or hormones for gender affirming care, if those are interrupted or if they go on too long or if the wrong therapies are used, those effects can become life-threatening. And so we've had a number of situations where we've had to advocate for movement of people who face imminent health risks or death. In terms of principles, what I'm hoping you're hearing is that refugee travel is essential travel. And we need to do everything we can to create the policy and operational capacity to help people move again. I also hope that you hear, or what I'll be sharing with you, is that the sort of the global and local networks among LGBTQI civil society organizations are critical connectors. So people have reached out, people who are, were on the move and their travel was interrupted have reached out to Canadian organizations and have been reconnected and have resettled. And local organizations on the ground have been able to manage, they were able to manage some of the last travels before the sort of the border lockdown, and have been able to manage some of the first safer arrivals under COVID. And so the capacity is there. Those arrivals are underway with resources and through a lot of collaboration. It's the question that is on many people's minds is what happens when the current sort of federal supports for COVID response shrink, and all of these collaborations that have been put in place, what happens to them? In terms of in Canada, arriving in pluralist Canadian cities, people, LGBTQI refugees bring hope for acceptance, belonging, and safety, but it's often actually a very confusing mix. There's this mix of some level of acceptance and legal protection, and even sort of the expectation to be out loud and proud, but overt and subtle threats and violence remain. While co-national communities are usually an important source of practical, social, and cultural and spiritual support, LGBTQI newcomers have to be very vigilant in how they navigate this to find the places of acceptance. Similarly, in LGBTQI communities, while again, there's this hope of sort of belonging and connection, pervasive racism, language, and cultural barriers make this belonging sometimes quite elusive. And finding the spaces in between that are both culturally safe and LGBTQI affirming takes time and navigation. Under the pandemic, what we've seen is there's been an emboldening of white supremacy and hate. I know here in Vancouver, we've had incredibly vocal, disruptive demonstrations that combine sort of a free speech movement rhetoric with anti-trans or anti-LGBT rhetoric. And these have resulted in actual assaults. There are people who have been hospitalized as a result of them. In combination with this, we're seeing that many LGBTQI newcomers are doing work that is essential. They're working, they're arriving and they're finding work. They're being recruited as caregivers, warehouse workers, grocery workers, the slaughterhouses that were mentioned earlier, meat processing plants. And so they are doing the essential work, but often under very precarious conditions, often not getting quite enough hours and not necessarily safe conditions. And they'll be some of the first to be let go when things shrink. We're also seeing similar to international conditions in Canada, risk of domestic violence and threat from landlords and roommates goes up exponentially, where typically I'd say with Rainbow Refugee, the local group here in Vancouver, has to deal with 2 to 3 evictions or emergency moves per year. They had that many in a period of 2 weeks in the first few weeks of the pandemic. When people are trying to reach out, part of what they are experiencing, is the same digital inequities that all newcomers are encountering when they try to reach out for services. But I want to highlight a couple of what I'll call LGBTQI specific digital inequities. One is remembering that is very hard for people to build kind of the trust that's needed to feel safe being open about their sexuality, gender identity, or expression. The signals that people use to kind of judge safety are different in digital environments. And what I'm hearing from settlement service providers is that they're having more troubles communicating that safety, even when they do want to be, openly affirming. And so that's one element I want to highlight. Another is that every time we access digital spaces, we have to provide some information, often our names, sometimes a title, a Mr., a Ms. All of these intake processes are potentially barriers for people who are gender diverse or trans. It's much harder now to navigate access to spaces for people whose legal name, the name that they use, the gender marker on their ID, and their gender presentation may or may not align. So hoping that people will think that through when they think about their intake processes. In terms of principles and learnings I'm taking from this experience so far is I'd really like us to encourage us to not think about the new normal or not aim for normal, because normal wasn't working very well for us before. This is an opportunity for us to really reflect and renew on what would a much more equitable society look like. In terms of ways of doing this, lived expertise informed redesign is critical, and I really appreciated Don bringing the videos, and I think the examples of bringing people together to share stories, to dialogue, and to co-create new ways of doing things is essential. It's important that we consider the systemic, the intersectional, and particularly for LGBTQI, the indirect impacts of COVID. And finally, that collaborations, and this is collaborations among civil society around the settlement sector, the LGBTQI sector, can flourish. And I've seen this happening under some really difficult circumstances. They can flourish when there's been reduced funding barriers. And here I'm going to highlight that, the Red Cross, Community Foundations of Canada funding has made a huge difference in different organizations' ability across Canada to meet the needs of LGBTQI refugees. And again, raising the question of what happens when that funding is not there.
Okay.
Finally, I'll leave you with a few resources that I hope that you'll look into, some that highlight the human rights status for SOGI diversity and some that speak specifically about the pandemic impacts. UN Special Rapporteur Victor Madrigal-Borloo has done quite a bit of research internationally, and his Aspire guidelines are incredibly useful for agencies wanting to think about their pandemic response in a SOGI responsive way.
Okay.
Very thankful for the time and look forward to the conversation.
Right. Thank you so much, Cherylin, for that very interesting presentation. We're going to move right along because we have about 20 minutes left. Et maintenant, notre présentation finale par Paul Muamba. Paul était avocat en République démocratique du Congo. Avant d'immigrer au Canada en 1999, il a 10 ans d'expérience dans le secteur d'immigration économique et d'employabilité. Il est actuellement chargé des projets en immigration économique et employabilité du RDE au Canada et il va nous présenter l'impact de la COVID-19 sur l'intégration professionnelle des nouveaux arrivants au Canada. Allez-y, Paul, la parole à vous. Votre micro, désallumé.
Oui, voilà. Bonjour et puis merci Enrico et merci à tous les autres panélistes. Donc ma présentation va être en français et puis elle tourne sur l'impact de la COVID-19 sur l'intégration professionnelle des nouveaux arrivants au Canada. Alors, moi je travaille pour RD Canada, comme a dit Enrico tout à l'heure. Donc, RD Canada, c'est une organisation pan-canadienne qui a 12 membres qui sont dans les 12 provinces et territoires du Canada hors Québec. Alors, pour revenir au sujet, donc l'impact de la COVID-19 sur l'intégration professionnelle des immigrants, on sait tous que une fois que les immigrants arrivent ici au Canada, ils ont de l'expérience à partir de leur pays d'origine et ils ont aussi des diplômes qu'ils ont obtenus, une éducation, et c'est toujours un défi pour eux de trouver un emploi qui correspond à leur expérience et qui correspond à leur diplôme. Donc, il y a plusieurs défis, mais nous en avons retenu juste 2 qui sont aggravés avec la crise de la COVID-19. Le premier défi, c'est la reconnaissance de l'expérience professionnelle acquise à l'étranger. C'est quelque chose qui devient encore plus difficile avec la crise de la COVID-19. Et puis, l'autre barrière que les immigrants connaissent pour leur intégration professionnelle, c'est le réseautage, donc le réseau professionnel. En ce qui concerne la reconnaissance des diplômes, en fait, quand les nouveaux arrivants arrivent au Canada, ils ont, pour la plupart, difficile à trouver un emploi dans leur domaine d'expertise et dans leur domaine d'études. Donc, ils vont travailler dans des emplois, je dirais, sous-qualifiés pour eux. Donc, il y a une étude de Statistique Canada qui démontre que les immigrants travaillent plus dans certains secteurs. Donc, les secteurs comme les secteurs d'hébergement, les secteurs manufacturiers, ils sont surreprésentés parce qu'au total, ils représentent à peu près 26% de la main-d'œuvre canadienne, mais ils sont surreprésentés dans certains domaines et cela est dû au fait qu'ils n'arrivent pas à trouver un emploi dans leur domaine d'expertise et d'études. Et cette difficulté d'intégration s'aggrave aussi pour certains pays de provenance. Donc, on va constater que les immigrants qui viennent d'Europe prennent moins de temps pour s'intégrer que ceux qui viennent d'Afrique. Donc, mais dans les deux cas, la crise de la COVID-19 a aggravé cela parce que, comme vous allez voir, la situation durant la pandémie a fait que les emplois qui favorisent un contact direct ont été très impactés par le chômage. Donc, les immigrants y étaient très représentés. Par exemple, vous avez le secteur de l'hébergement qui a perdu près de 75%, hébergement et restauration, presque 75% de perte d'emploi durant la pandémie. Et il y avait une forte représentation des immigrants dans cette catégorie d'emploi. Donc, en termes clairs, lorsque les immigrants arrivent, ils travaillent d'abord pour acquérir la fameuse expérience canadienne dans des domaines comme celui-là, mais avec la crise, ça devient difficile. Ils ont perdu de l'emploi dans ces domaines-là. Toujours en ce qui concerne la crise de la COVID-19, donc nous allons passer au deuxième critère, deuxième barrière qui a été très impactée par la COVID-19, c'est le réseautage professionnel. Alors au Canada, plusieurs experts, c'est un débat, que représentent les emplois cachés au Canada. Donc il y en a qui parlent de 80%, 70%, mais pour avoir accès à ces emplois cachés, en fait, ce sont des emplois non affichés. Pour avoir accès à ces emplois-là, il faut avoir un réseau professionnel bien établi. Et les immigrants n'ont pas de réseau professionnel parce que ce sont des nouveaux arrivants. Et surtout les immigrants récents. Donc, la crise de la COVID-19 a aggravé encore cette situation parce que les gens sont en confinement et les immigrants ont perdu leur emploi parce qu'ils travaillaient dans des domaines où il y avait un contact direct et les domaines qui ont été le plus touchés. Donc, finalement, les immigrants n'arrivent plus, à cause de la crise de la COVID-19, à développer un réseau professionnel qui va leur permettre d'atteindre leurs objectifs d'intégration professionnelle. Et comme vous savez, au Canada, près de 70% des emplois sont générés par des PME. Et une étude de Statistique Canada démontre aussi que les PME souvent n'ont pas de direction de ressources humaines et ils utilisent beaucoup le réseautage pour embaucher à partir de leurs employés ou à partir de leur réseau personnel. Donc, ce qui rend encore le réseautage professionnel très important au Canada, et à cause justement de cette crise de la pandémie, les immigrants sont exclus un petit peu de, de ce réseau-là, à cause justement de la crise et à cause au fait que les gens sont en confinement et les immigrants ne peuvent pas développer vraiment des contacts. Alors, au niveau de notre organisme Rédé Canada, nous avons développé plusieurs stratégies avec nos organismes membres pour pallier à cette situation-là. D'abord à la situation de la perte d'emploi. Donc, on a mis en place des programmes en ligne pour appuyer les immigrants à retrouver le plus rapidement un emploi ou bien à profiter du temps où ils n'avaient pas un emploi, de s'améliorer professionnellement au niveau de la langue ou bien au niveau des compétences interculturelles, au niveau aussi du réseautage. Alors, pour le réseautage, on a organisé aussi avec nos membres, les membres organisent plusieurs webinaires d'échange avec des immigrants un peu plus anciens que les nouveaux pour bâtir des ponts et développer un réseau professionnel qui leur permettront peut-être d'acquérir, d'obtenir un emploi qui correspond à leurs compétences. Donc, en conclusion, je dirais que la crise de la COVID-19 a eu un impact important sur le parcours d'intégration professionnelle des immigrants récents, comme on l'a démontré tout à l'heure, aussi bien par la perte d'emploi, parce que les secteurs des immigrants où les immigrants sont majoritairement représentés ont été touchés, aussi du fait que le réseautage professionnel a été très fortement impacté. Autre chose aussi qu'il faut mentionner, les femmes immigrantes qui forment une sous-catégorie des immigrants, elles ont été encore plus impactées parce qu'elles étaient encore plus nombreuses dans les secteurs à contact direct, notamment hébergement et restauration. Elles ont été encore plus atteintes que la population immigrante en général. Donc, en conclusion, un dernier point de conclusion, on dira qu'il faudrait que les gouvernements attirent une attention particulière à cette catégorie parce qu'ils ont besoin d'un appui particulier. Il y a des programmes qui ont été mis en place, mais ces programmes-là doivent être bonifiés parce que le parcours d'immigrants pour l'intégration professionnelle avait eu au cours des dernières années tendance à raccourcir un peu. On parlait à peu près de 6 mois pour une intégration professionnelle, mais avec cette pandémie, ce temps d'intégration professionnelle va être rallongé. Donc, il faudrait que les gouvernements à tous les paliers, donc le gouvernement aussi bien fédéral, provincial que municipal, pensent à bonifier les programmes d'aide d'intégration professionnelle des immigrants parce que ça va prendre plus de temps avec tout ce que nous avons décrit plus haut. Donc, voilà un petit peu la présentation que j'avais aujourd'hui. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Paul. Et bien sûr, vous avez pris à peu près 9 minutes, si je me permets, en temps que les autres se préparent avec des questions. Et nous constatons que les défis des nouveaux migrants relativement au marché du travail se sont amplifiés pendant la pandémie. Avez-vous des données ou des constatations en ce qui a trait à la situation des immigrants francophones hors Québec en particulier? Si vous pouvez dire ça dans 2 minutes, ce sera apprécié.
Oui, merci. Donc, il y a une étude qu'on est en train de faire ici pour établir ça. Mais la situation des immigrants francophones hors Québec est encore plus affectée parce qu'il y a un autre facteur qui intervient, c'est la langue. Et donc, les communautés francophones hors Québec sont minoritaires linguistiquement parce qu'ils vivent dans des provinces majoritairement anglophones. Donc, il y a aussi la langue qui intervient en dehors des autres défis, notamment la reconnaissance des diplômes, le manque de réseau. Et là, on ajoute encore un autre défi qui est la langue. Donc, il y a une étude qui est en train d'être faite pour faire ressortir ces éléments-là, mais c'est sûr que leur situation est encore plus difficile.
Et merci. Et nous passons maintenant à les questions. Really, thank you for those questions. If you have more, we have about 6 minutes. That it's not much, but it's plenty. So let me read the first question to you. How much thought is given to concepts such as UBI, that's Universal Basic Income, to help offset this disproportionately harms experienced by racialized newcomers? And the other question, how can we address LGBTQI discrimination in newcomer community, especially those communities that settlement workers do not belong to? And how do we overcome pandemic fears that harden Canadian attitudes toward immigration and generate pressure to reduce the number of new arrivals? So these are 3 questions. I guess who wants to start at the concept of the UBI? Don't be shy. Okay. You've all heard the questions, I believe. So who wants to start with that first set? Anybody?
Enrico, I'll step in if nobody else.
Please.
Yeah. So want to just say that I'm a psychologist, not an economist, but we've all in Canada had the opportunity to see I think the positive impacts through the CERB of having something like a guaranteed minimum income or universal basic income. And I do see this as a direction we need to be going. It assures people that they have the basic needs. Here in BC, it's very clear that the amount offered for income assistance keeps people below the poverty line. And we need to be looking at ways to ensure that ordinary people can ride out the inevitable ups and downs that happen with crises, with capitalism. And I'll turn it over to someone else who wants to speak on that.
Yes, please. Anybody?
I can share.
Please do.
I believe this policy or other measure like UBI, the Universal Basic Income process might help in sustaining basic needs that families are experiencing, the pressure of choosing between their health versus the need of earning a wage in order to maintain a house or a roof over their head, or even just being able to purchase food. We're seeing families who are making a choice between paying a rent or reducing the amount of food that they will purchase throughout the month. So I agree with Cherylin that some of these measures will allow families to at least have those options and reduce the amount of stress and mental health concerns and discrimination or marginalized oppression that they are experiencing.
Thank you for that, Nina. Any of the 2 other speakers that want to react? We have about 2 minutes, but of course, you've all done interesting presentations. We've heard some very important questions and some good answers. I believe that the dialogue will continue and must continue. Do I hear anything from the floor? Paul, est-ce que vous voulez réagir à la dernière couplet de questions? Oui? Oh, here we are. We have a question for Paul. What are the strategies or solutions that can help immigrants integrate the self-employment or business in this pandemic? Quelles sont les stratégies ou les solutions qui puissent aider les immigrants à s'intégrer avec l'emploi ou dans les affaires, dans la pandémie? Paul, c'est à vous. Et puis j'ai une autre question.
Oui, alors pour l'emploi, donc comme j'ai dit tout à l'heure, les stratégies sont d'améliorer le réseautage, de prendre le temps où les gens sont sans emploi pour améliorer leur profil professionnel en ce qui concerne la langue et les technologies. Alors, pour l'entrepreneuriat, c'est aussi une possibilité. Vous savez qu'en temps de crise, il y a toujours des opportunités d'affaires. Il y a plusieurs programmes qui existent au niveau de Rede Canada pour aider les gens à se lancer en affaires. Donc, j'inviterai les gens à nous contacter. Et puis, il y a des programmes en entrepreneuriat, des programmes en employabilité pour les nouveaux arrivants. Et comme j'ai dit, on demande au gouvernement aussi d'appuyer cette catégorie-là pour les aider à pouvoir réintégrer, à s'intégrer professionnellement malgré cette crise pandémique.
Thank you. Merci, Paul. We have one last question. Should we not highlight immigrants and non-immigrants who are experiencing hardship to come together to advocate for more resources, health, financial, and technical? And the other question is for LGBTI refugees. The flexibility of funders, i.e. Red Cross, was mentioned. Can you speak specifically what flexibility is required? So we'll start for the LGBTI question, and then the highlight of about immigrants and non-immigrants who are experiencing hardship. So I guess, Cherylin, that first question is over to you.
Thank you, Enrico. I'm going to come back to the initial question around LGBTQI discrimination in newcomer communities, and just want to touch on some opportunities. I think here it is important that settlement organizations be partnering with local diasporic communities to kind of find and create safer spaces that are culturally safe as well as LGBTQI affirming. I'm thinking of local examples here in Vancouver. We have the El Tui Mosque, the Unity Mosque. It is both LGBTQ affirming and friendly for, it's a prayer space and discussion circle for Muslims. There are Philippines specific groups there, each community will kind of have a diasporic community that is also LGBTQI affirming, and settlement organizations should be kind of cultivating partnerships with them. And then I see the question on the flexibility of funders that's needed. We need to recognize that most LGBTQI civil society organizations at this point are very stretched, and many, particularly in smaller communities, are not necessarily charities. Some are not even registered not-for-profits. And so something that was very helpful about this rollout of funding was that it was accessible to not-for-profits, and there was some, and also there were sort of sub ways to distribute money to organizations that were not registered. And this is absolutely critical. There needs to be capacity building in this sector and across the settlement and LGBTQ civil society sector.
And thank you very much. And then the last question, should not we highlight immigrants and non-immigrants who are experiencing hardship to come together to advocate for more resources, health, financial, and technical assistance? We have 1 minute. Who wants to answer to that? In 1 minute?
Of course we should. We should try and create dialogue everywhere. And sometimes we have to help just provide a pathway for those voices to get out and be heard by all. But the more we hear each other, the more we understand what the issues and gaps are and how to advocate so that they change.
Very well. Brave Twice for using the video, answering under 1 minute. I want to extend my own personal thanks to all of our panelists and to all of you for attending, for putting the questions. Time is about 3 minutes over, but I think we had a very interesting question. I want to thank our technician and once again P2P for giving us the opportunity. So this concludes our plenary session. Again, thank you so much to each and every panelist for their excellent presentation. And I hope that the participants enjoyed it as much as we did. Too bad we couldn't do this in person, but there is always hope and we will succeed. Il va tous aller bien. Thank you so much.